Good evening, everyone. Um, I am Tanukoli Bagwe, faculty for the Center for Global Engagement and your host for this evening's Engage Your World event. Um, for those who might not know, November is celebrated as the International Education Month at FSU. And in the 2020 inaugural message for International Education Month, President Thrasher dedicated this time to recognize the benefits of international education and acknowledge the importance of global connections and perspectives. He also acknowledged that providing opportunities for global engagement and nurturing a rich multicultural environment are the key to both student and faculty success. His message closely aligns with the objectives of the Engage Your World speaker series. We try to bring practitioners and scholars to examine opportunities and challenges that connect us globally. And the goal is to create spaces to learn and have a dialogue on different dimensions of a common topic and to foster global engagement. Our speaker today is Mr. Steve Springer. Mr. Springer is the Director of Regulatory Practice Liaison for NAFSA, Association of International Educators. He manages NAFSA's engagement with federal agencies concerning regulatory practice issues. And he's active in the American Immigration Lawyers Association, having worked as an immigration attorney representing higher education institutions, their faculty, staff, and students, as well as in-house management of immigration services for major research universities. Mr. Springer also spent time in Poland as a Peace Corps volunteer, which gave him a deep appreciation for the virtues of international engagement. Today, he will be presenting on on the very specific and real impacts of immigration regulations that impact the future of incoming international students to the US. These regulations have a broader impact on economic growth in the US, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. Before I formally hand it over to Mr. Springer, I have a few housekeeping rules that I'm going to post on the chat window for all of you to see. If you do have any questions from Mr. Springer, please send them to me at any time using the chat feature. We will have the Q&A after the talk. So Steve, the stage is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for the kind introduction and the opportunity to join you here today. Okay, yeah, we can just skip the title slide, please. Yeah, so I just wanted to start out by mentioning a few things that probably you're already familiar with a lot of the value that international students bring to the US, but I want to just briefly cover a few because this is what's at stake, in the discussion we're having today. So there are just over 1 million international students in the US last year. We just got the figures for last academic year, 2019-2020. And for that year, enrollments were down 1.8%. New enrollments were down 10%. And that 1.8% number is a little bit misleading because a couple of years ago, the Immigration Service issued a new rule that allows students to stay longer to do what's called practical training after they finish their degree programs. And this number, this 1 million number, includes both those students, which was a huge increase, in the number of students. And it doesn't reflect some of what we're seeing as far as a real decline in interest among prospective students in studying in the US. And it's something that's obviously deeply concerning for us. We think it's going to play out for a while. It started, we've started a downward trend. We haven't seen the worst effects yet. And then, of course, the IIE is the of International Education, and they also just put out the fall snapshot for this fall term. And like everything else nowadays, it's pretty grim. We've seen a 16% decline in overall international student enrollment and 43% in new student enrollment. But again, this seems to be related to COVID, and it's hard to separate out what's exactly what's causing the downward trend. But I think we're seeing a long-term downward trend in international students coming to the U.S. We hope we'll recover some of that with the new administration. And then due to COVID, we're seeing some downward movement as well. Well, of course, again, I think you all know that international students play a hugely important role on our campuses. They help internationalize our campus and our communities. They bring a lot of talent to the U.S. They make us more competitive. A lot of them go home and become leaders in their home country, ambassadors to the U.S. For the U.S. And so just all kind of what I would call maybe soft benefits that they bring to our country. And then also they contribute a huge amount to the economy. I mean, there's a huge economic value in international student programs. For last academic year, it was $38.7 billion that they contributed to the U.S. economy, and that was down a little bit from the prior year. And they support 415,996 jobs in the U.S. So there's also that aspect, just the purely, economic aspect that they bring as well. And of course, one of the things that we've seen in the last few years, just as we were starting to, as a government, let me call it that, put out sort of negative vibes to prospective international students and kind of perhaps give an impression that they weren't welcome here. And we're implementing some regulations and agency policies that were making it more difficult for them to come and thrive here. We were also seeing tremendous competition from other countries for international students. So again, we've gone from just explosive growth over a few years, and then long-term steady growth, to now seeing a decline in our numbers. So that's what I'm most concerned about, in the work that I do. So next slide, please. So I will not even try to go through, we would be here all night and then half of the day tomorrow if I tried to go through all the travel bans and travel proclamations, but I wanted to just put a few up on the slides. And of course you can go access these if you're interested in any particular ones of them, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how many are out there. And I mean, some are specific to certain kinds of visas, like work visas. Some are supposedly to protect the job market. Others are directed at specific countries. And so there are quite a few of these that were COVID related that have all come about, in the last 6 months or so. And then next slide, please. There were quite a lot of other travel bans that you may have heard about. Some of these were the ones that were in the news a lot during the early years of the administration, the so-called travel ban 3.0, travel ban 4.0. You may recall that some of the early travel bans, the so-called Muslim travel bans, were challenged in court, and they went through quite a bit of litigation, and they went through quite a bit of revision. And then finally, there was a travel ban 3.0 that was allowed to stand, and then it was changed just a little bit to be travel ban 4.0. And so that's still out there in addition to the COVID related travel bans. There's a travel ban on certain students and researchers from China. It's primarily ones that are suspected or thought to have some connection to the Chinese military. And there have been a few other orders and memos from the administration that have made life pretty difficult for, I think, universities in bringing faculty and researchers and in bringing students here. And the enhanced screening and vetting order is one that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And that was, on its face, that seems like it would be fine. Nobody's not in favor, I think, of, good security for the United States. I think we all want, secure borders and secure processes for admitting people into the US. And this order, I think, though, has had some effects that are really difficult for the higher ed community. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So just a few of the key regulatory changes, and there have been really quite a lot. And I think probably when I go through these, they won't sound all that significant, each one. But I think all in all, they add up to a pretty significant change in our how we look inviting or not to prospective international students. So I mentioned the enhanced screening and vetting policy. And a lot of critics of this policy said we already had super enhanced screening and vetting. Anybody who's come here from another country, that we have extraordinarily enhanced screening and vetting. So a lot of people thought there was not much need for this. That it was kind of what we've come to call security theater, where the politicians and other folks like to do something that sounds and looks like it's enhancing security, but maybe it's not so much. And it led to quite a few specific developments. One was increased social media account and personal electronic device checks at the port of entry. And these can be pretty difficult. I mean, when you have to turn over your laptop to a CBP official to inspect it, and they look at your social media accounts to see if you've posted anything that seems like it might be, sort of inflammatory. And you always worry about the subjective nature of that kind of activity on behalf of the government. There's a new visa application form that asks questions about social media accounts that visa applicants have. And again, nobody wants people to come here who've said terroristic things on social media accounts, but we always worry that some visa officers, elderly ones like me, my age, might not understand what the young people are talking about on social media nowadays, and kind of misunderstand something somebody has said and deny them a visa because of that. So it's a little bit troubling, and I think there are not very good standards for making those kinds of judgments. The USCIS that I have listed there is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security, and it's the branch that adjudicates most of the applications and so forth that non-immigrants like students and people with work visas have to file. And I think the enhanced vetting order really added a lot of burdens to the people who file applications. It really slowed processing. And the USCIS is having they're in dire financial straits right now, partly because of the economy. They're fee funded. So of course, when the economy slowed down, companies and employers are not hiring as many people on work visas and paying those gigantic fees they have to pay to do that. So the agency is suffering because of that. And it also seems like they're suffering because they maybe overdid it a little bit on over-analyzing applications, demanding far too much excess documentation and so forth. And so the critics of all of this have said that this administration really did build a wall, but it's not so much the wall down at the southern border, it's a paper wall, and it's not against illegal immigration, it's against legal immigration. So it's been a tough few years for people who want to do legal immigration the right way, meaning companies and people coming here for green cards and students and so forth. So another thing that we had was a so-called unlawful presence policy, and I won't go into this. This is a very long and drawn out discussion, but let's just say it would be enhanced penalties for students who stay beyond their program. And again, nobody wants students to stay beyond their program. But this would have allowed the government, we think, to make some judgment calls about things that happen during the students' programs, and after the fact say, well, you violated your status a few years ago, and now we caught you. And the students not know and be innocent and maybe have just made a tiny misstep, or maybe even their advisors at their schools have made a tiny misstep. And so there was a lawsuit filed against this, and it was withdrawn after litigation. I think it's going to be a rule if this administration has time, and we can talk about that later. There was a big fee increase from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Again, the stakeholder community sued them, and the fee increase is on hold due to the litigation. There's been a bunch of rules to expand collection of biometrics. Maybe these are just keeping up with the times, but they certainly seem to add additional burdens to coming here. And then finally, there was a public charge rule, which is a longstanding part of our immigration law, that you can't look like you're going to be a public charge, meaning somebody who would basically be on welfare, to come here as a non-immigrant. And they expanded this greatly. And again, nobody wants to bring students here who don't have the finances to study, and students have to prove their finances to study to come here. But we worried about the kinds of decision-making that the government would do based on this public charge rule. So those are a few of the key changes since 2016. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what I want to talk about, sort of the main focus here today, and I know it's taken me a long time to get here, and probably it'll be disappointing because I won't spend that much time on it, but I wanted to focus on what I watch a lot at my work, which is the administration's regulatory agenda. And let me just explain quickly what that is. So the government puts this out twice a year. It comes out in the spring and the fall. And it's basically a list of regulatory activity that the government is engaged in per agency. So each agency says, here are the main things that we're working on. And it's just a good way to give the heads up to the stakeholder community about what may be coming their way. Now, so that's great, right? We love the fact that we get a heads up about what to be looking for as far as possible regulations coming and so forth. The downside of it is that we don't have any details about it all. They usually just put one or two sentences. So sometimes it raises more questions than it answers. We're still working with the spring 2020 regulatory agenda. The fall agenda is expected out soon, but we haven't seen it yet. Should be out any day now. And so I want to just highlight three things on the spring agenda. And the other things, I'll just draw your attention to the non-highlighted things and just say, notice the pattern there. There are a lot of new fees, a lot of increasing fees, and so forth. And that's a pattern that we've seen recently. And again, when we're facing stiff competition from other countries to bring students here, and we're increasing tremendously the fees they have to pay, we worry that it's a disincentive. Okay, so I want to focus on three things, three of the big things that are on the agenda. The first has already happened. They got actually, sometimes things, by the way, stay on the agenda for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they don't meet their target dates, and they just keep adding it and so forth. And this one actually preceded its target date. And it's elimination of duration of status for F and J students. And F students are the main students on most campuses. There are also J students. Those are called exchange visitor students. There are fewer of them, but those are the two visa classifications of students that come to the US. And they are not admitted for a specific end date because the government, in its wisdom many years ago, decided that, look, I mean, they're coming here, they might stay for an additional program, they might transfer to a new school, they might need a little bit of an extension for their program to finish their program. And so the government set it up, these two categories, so that as long as you were doing the right things to maintain your immigration status, your advisor at your school, like in your international office at FSU, is the one who can extend you. And this is all tracked in a database you may have heard of called CVIS. And so it's all very well recorded. It's all very clear. Nobody's getting away with anything. But the nice thing about having duration of status rather than a specific end date is that you could do things like finish 1 year of English language learning, and then go get a bachelor's, and then go get a master's and even a PhD without having to file new applications with the immigration service and so forth. So the government put out a rule last month to do away with that and to add an end date for students and require them to file an application. And I'll just cut to the chase with this and give you the short version of the huge problem with that is that the agency that would be the USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, that adjudicates those applications often has a 6-month processing time. They've in recent years had as much as an 18-month processing time. So you file an application and it's going to be 6 months before you get a decision on that. It may even be up to 18 months if they get a big backlog. And so for us, that's a huge downside for students. It just puts them in a terrible situation where they're waiting for an application to be decided and they can't do the things that they would like to do. They may have problems traveling and so forth. So we wrote a comment letter. Thousands of others wrote comment letters. Some state attorney generals wrote comment letters, and we'll see if the government finalizes this. It was published as a proposed rule. So it is not in effect yet. They would have to issue a final rule to put it into effect. The next one I wanted to mention just very quickly is this unlawful presence policy. And again, I think this nobody is advocating for students to stay past their time of their program here. And that was not the problem with this unlawful presence policy. The policy allows the government to go back and look if you ever made a tiny misstep in your status. And if you have worked with any international students, you know that they are in one of the most complicated legal statuses that you can be in this country. There's so many ways that you could maybe drop a class. Maybe your academic advisor would let you drop a class, but now you've violated the immigration rules because you have to take a certain number of classes. So it's a very complex legal situation that they're in. And at the current time, it's possible if you make one of those little missteps to file for what's called reinstatement and get your status back and everything would be fine. But the unlawful presence policy would change that and make it very difficult, very punitive. And the biggest problem of all with it is if the mistake happened more than a year ago in your past, you have a 10-year bar on returning to the US. So just for example, let's say that you're an international student, you finished your degree program, you think you did everything right, everybody thinks you did everything right. You've got a job now and you are going to use your practical training for a year to go get some work experience in your job before you go back to your home country. And you file an application for your work card with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. And they look back at your whole history and they say, aha, wait a minute. We see here that you did some curricular practical training a few years ago. And we don't think that was closely related enough to your field of study. We know that your advisor thinks that, and both your academic advisor and your international student advisor, but we don't think so. So now you have violated your status and you have a 10-year bar on coming back to the US. So huge penalties. The target date for that was September. We haven't seen it yet. I'm hoping the time runs out for this administration, and I don't think the next administration would be interested in doing this. And then the last one I'll mention is reform of practical training. And again, I've mentioned this a couple of times. Sometimes you hear it referred to as optional practical training. Students get to stay if they want to after their program of study, after they finish their program of study and they graduate, they get to do what's called optional practical training where they can stay for a year. And then if they're in a STEM field, they can stay up to 3 years, certain STEM fields, and get some experiential education, some experiential learning in the field that they've studied. And so they can work in the US. And this is tremendously valuable to international students. Like it's one thing to come to the US and get a US degree. It's another thing entirely to go back to your home country with a US degree and a year or up to 3 years of work experience. I mean, just imagine how useful that would be if you're a US person to have worked for a year in another country. And so we're very worried about this. We know that reform means they're going to limit this. They're going to cut it back. And there are all kinds of politics about this, and there are all kinds of pundits and political people who say it takes away American jobs. That's never been my experience working with international students or working in a law firm. these are not the people, these are not people taking away American jobs. They're usually highly trained, highly educated people who employers have to pay a lot of extra money to get because it requires a lot of filing fees and sometimes legal fees and so forth. So those are the three I just wanted to mention. Again, these are things that, you know, the public, this is not going to be on the public's radar screen. And you really have to sort of be involved in this field to understand how these all add up to some real big disincentives, I think, for students to come here and study. As I said, we're waiting for the fall agenda, and we hope to see that soon. Next slide, please. So a few other things that have been difficult for international student programs. Last spring, you know, let me summarize what's a sort of complex regulatory scenario just by shorthand, saying that international students are allowed to take only one online course per term, right? So unlike US students who can take as many as they want, as many as the school will allow, the federal regulations allow international students only to take one online course per term. So obviously last spring when schools started saying, well, we're going to go online only, or we're going to go hybrid and those kinds of things, it presented a huge problem for international programs offices and for international students because the regulations didn't allow them to do this. Some of them were not allowed to travel to their home countries because of travel bans, you know, into their home countries, and couldn't get flights and all sorts of things. So it was a very difficult situation. Another aspect of this is that international students often have what's called on-campus employment in the regulations. So they're allowed to work part-time on campus, for example, as a teaching assistant or a research assistant. But of course, that's pretty much expected to happen physically on the campus. So again, when last spring when schools said we're going virtual, you know, a TA from other country, we'd like you to still keep doing your teaching, you know, from your home. Well, there was a big moment of concern, and there was, I understand that the Department of Homeland Security, and this is particularly SEVP, the Student and Exchange Visitor Program, tried to get out some guidance that would allow students to take their courses online. And they did so. It was slow coming, and I do understand that. I work with these people pretty much on a daily basis. I know them to be good people. They were in a difficult situation. It's hard to write that kind of guidance, and it's hard to write it, especially in the kind of administration that they were working in. You know, anything that would enable students to stay and continue their programs. They did so. There were some problems with it. There were some lawsuits. There were some upheavals of my field. There were a lot of people unhappy. There were congressional inquiries and all sorts of things. And to make a long story short, they finally got out some decent guidance. They continued it for the summer, and they continued it and updated it slightly for the fall. Now, surprisingly, if you don't work in this field, for me, it's not that surprising to see that. We still don't have guidance for this coming spring. And, you know, I used to work at universities. I know that universities don't start planning spring term on November 17th, right? Like you've been planning spring term many, many moons ago. So the guidance for spring term is very late. We're hoping they'll continue the same kind of guidance where they do allow international students to continue in hybrid and online courses until we can all get back to our sort of normal in-person classes. We don't know that yet. We're putting inquiries in pretty much weekly to SEVP to ask when they're going to issue the new guidance. One other thing I wanted to mention is there's a lawsuit against this thing I mentioned called OPT, or practical training. It's that thing that allows international students to work in their field of study to get a year of work experience, or up to 3 years if they do a STEM degree after they graduate. A lawsuit was filed by a union of technical workers from Washington State. It's called WashTech, challenging the OPT program. And they would like to just make it go away. They would like to have it deemed invalid or illegal. And this has been around for 30 years, 40 years. So it's a pretty big lift, but we were deeply concerned that the administration might not vigorously defend the program. It looks like they're defending it. The next hearing is on December 1st, so just a couple of weeks away, and we hope that it will survive that hearing. Again, this is a huge draw for students to the U.S. As I said, they often want to come here and get a degree. They love the idea of getting a year of work experience and going back home. And of course, some of them end up being hired by U.S. companies as well after that year of work experience. So it's a great way to put yourself out there on the job market and see what happens as well. Well, of course, due to COVID, the consulates closed down all over the world. They've been slowly reopening. Visa applications have been so difficult and so problematic. You can imagine there were backlogs, there were all sorts of problems. And I fear that now we may see consulates closing again, but they've been slowly reopening and issuing visas so that the brave souls who are willing to come here physically can actually do that, who are not subject to a travel ban. And then finally, as I mentioned, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is experiencing huge, severe financial shortfalls. They've been threatening furloughs and so forth, and even further fee increases. So again, those are some of the challenges we're facing right now. As I said, it's been a difficult few years. I hope I've summed that up pretty well. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in any more of this, I'm sure this presentation can be made available to you so you can get the links, but all of this is available on our website. We do have an advocacy vehicle called Connecting Our World. It's a grassroots advocacy vehicle. A lot of people who are NAFSA members join that, but you don't have to be. If you just have any kind of interest in international programs, please join that. We often sort of put out helpers to calls for help to people to contact their congressional offices or do things in their state and so forth. Everything I've mentioned here, including the regulatory agenda, all of NAFSA's comment letters, all of the updates about litigation. And by the way, that has been by far the most effective tool during this administration. You may have heard more about litigation, lawsuits against the government than you've ever heard before. Certainly for me, it was that. And a lot of them have been very effective, not all of them. And we have filed briefs in a lot of those cases. They're called amicus briefs, where we can kind of weigh in a case and say, well, here's what we think based on our experience and knowledge of the field. We have a lot of public policy updates and resources, including numbers like the economic data that I cited earlier. I've given you a link for those. Where I pulled the student numbers is from the IIE, the Institute of International Education. They do a fantastic open doors report. The deep details of that, I think you have to purchase, but the high level details are free, and it's super informative and enlightening. And then of course the Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security also offers what they call SEVIS by the numbers. And SEVIS is the database that international students are tracked in. And so obviously they have good numbers on who's coming and going from the country and how many students are in each state and so forth. And so their SEVIS by the numbers page is pretty useful too if you're interested in this kind of information. And I think I'll stop there. That's a lot, and see if you have any questions. I hope I haven't put everybody to sleep.
Thank you so much, Steve. If you do have any questions, please post them in the chat window directly to me or to our dean, who is a co-host for the event. There are a few that I would like to pose to you, Steve. And one of the first and primary questions was, what do you expect from the next administration? And and the second part of the same question was, what do you expect to happen in the next 2 months or before January 20th? And what do you expect from the next administration in terms of international student immigration policies?
Yeah. So, it's so funny. As we were talking, planning this, my presentations for the last 3 or 4 years have been so sort of downcast and sad and doom and gloom. But obviously, there's some light at the end of the tunnel for us. And look, I want to be careful. Like I'm not coming here today to talk, politics or anything like that. My association is 10,000 members. And so we are going to have members of all stripes, all political stripes. But I think I can say objectively that this has not been a good administration for international student programs. And interestingly enough, whatever this election means for the rest of the country, it seems so unclear given how divided we are and all of that stuff. But for what we do for our field and for the regulatory environment, the administration, it's 100% that. I mean, politicians don't really have that much input into the regulatory environment. It's the people appointed to the agencies and those civil service workers at the agencies. So I am much more hopeful. I mean, the 8 years of the prior administration were fantastic. I mean, it was an opposite kind of burden during that administration, and burden is not the right word for it, but we were swamped with work because that administration was so interested in promoting international student programs. And for example, our CEO was on what's called the Homeland Security Academic Advisory Council. What was called that? There wasn't one during this administration. And they reported directly to Secretary. It was a group of a small number of university presidents and a few association heads. And they made recommendations to the Department of Homeland Security about all kinds of academic issues. And obviously, my CEO was involved in making recommendations about international student programs. And the administration was interested in what they could do to make the U.S. more attractive to prospective international students and make their experience here better. And it was a lot of work. It was fantastic work, but that was a lot of work. Very different, obviously, than the situation we're in now. I hope they will revive that. I mean, it was really wonderful to be able to put recommendations forward from my community of 10,000 to the Secretary Napolitano or Secretary Jay Johnson, for example. So I hope that will come back. I know that there will be more managers appointed to heads of agencies rather than talking heads from news flamethrower talking heads from news programs. That's been a really difficult thing to have people running these agencies who I don't think they don't seem to know what they're doing. And so it's a very difficult situation. So that's the upside. I'm afraid during the next couple of months, I was using the term scorched earth, but I've been hearing a lot of the pundits say salted earth, which sounds even better. It seems like what they're doing. Probably a fairer way to look at it would be to say that I think the administration is going to be trying to accomplish a lot of its goals at the very last minute. And so I think it's going to be a rough next couple of months. I think after that, things are looking up very much. It will take this administration a while to put in new people at the top and new policies and so forth. But I think it's looking much more positive. And I know the rhetoric's going to be better, first of all. I know that the rhetoric out of the new administration won't make people wonder if they're going to be welcome here if they come to study here.
Another question we have been asked is exactly how does the reversal, what is the process of reversal of something like these? So there are a bunch of regulations that have been passed. How easy or hard it is to actually reverse them, to bring them back to the state they were before 2016?
Yeah, great question. So short answer for that would be that some of the things that have been proposed are not final regulations yet. So I hope those will just no longer be priorities and they will just kind of, be tossed in the dustbin. Regulations implemented at the end of an administration, there's a way that Congress can quickly remove those. It's called the Congressional Review Act. I don't know. It would be interesting to see whether Congress would be together enough on something like that. I will say that, we have quite a lot of people from both parties who are big proponents of international student programs. So, it is definitely not just sort of like a Democratic bastion. I mean, we have a lot of Republican members of Congress who are very pro international programs. So maybe some of the most difficult ones can be reversed through that. Others will have to be put through the regular process of, notice and comment in the Federal Register and all of that stuff, and then implemented. But I think, the probably worse than the regulations that have been implemented during this administration have been the policies, and those can be changed overnight. Just to say, look, we want security. Make sure it's a valid application. Don't go on a fishing expedition and make people send 3 new sets of documents and so forth. That sort of thing can be very helpful. So I think the policy, I hope the policy reversals, and I think the policy reversals will come pretty quickly, and the regulatory stuff I hope will follow.
We have one more question about the basically you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that the US has been essentially losing its status as a prime international education destination. Could you shed some light on how other countries have benefited from students who would have otherwise come to the US?
Sure. Yeah. And this goes back. I go back a long way with this. I used to recruit international students for a university as part of my job. I was director of an English language program. This is 100 years ago in a different lifetime. And I did some recruiting for the university at the time. And this was, like I say, 20 years ago. And at that time, we were just beginning to see some competition from other countries. So like Australia was just beginning to compete for international students. The UK just beginning harder to compete for international students, and maybe Canada a little bit. And so what we've seen in recent years is some of those players getting very much more serious about it. Canada has a national, I forgot what the full name of it is, but they have created a national plan for international student growth. And so, it's not one administration. I mean, it's like the government long-term agreed on this and implemented it. And it's all basically just about making it easier to get to the country, still all the security, of course, in place, and then making it easier to get the work authorization. Because as I said, that's what students want so much, not to come here to work as a job, but to come here and to get some experience, maybe work part-time while they're in school and so forth. And so in addition to those long-time players in the market, you've seen all kinds of others, like obviously like China now has huge international programs. So many other new countries have entered the market. So it is very competitive right now. And if you look back at the IIE Open Doors reports, you'll see years where we had 9, 10, 12% growth in our programs. And I suspect now it's 10% down. I mean, we don't really exactly know, because we've had this weird thing where we had the increasing number of OPT students and decreasing number of enrolled students. But I suspect we're looking at a 10% decrease. And most people say that it's two or three things. The number one thing is the rhetoric coming out, that makes you feel like you're not going to be welcome here. For a long time, there have been concerns among people thinking about coming to this country about whether it's safe here, because you hear so many things about, guns in the US and all that stuff. And we have those terrible school shooting incidents. So there's concerns about safety. And then when you mix a kind of a, foreigner, you're not welcome here message with a place that you already wonder if it's pretty safe or not, it's very difficult, I think, for people's families. I mean, imagine you're living in another country. You've got a 17-year-old student, 18-year-old student. That's a big step to send them to a foreign country. And so that combined with the, as I said earlier, the strong recruitment and benefits from other countries to prospective international students, and then the policies that we're putting out also that makes it harder to get a visa, more expensive to get a visa. You have to get a visa more times while you're here. You've got so many complicated rules to follow. And you're told constantly that if you make a tiny misstep, you're going to be deported. And, you don't really have to wonder too much why people say like, yeah, maybe I'll just go to Canada. So.
That's very useful to kind of understand what the economic impact is, because as your slide also showed, there was this massive, it's not just the tuition that's coming in, it's also the massive spending that international students do over here. We have more questions, and I'm not going in the order that they were collected, but in the theme that we are going with. So I promise to get to all of them. One of the questions that was asked and related to economic interests were, are business groups supportive of the OPT, the optional practical training that you talked about, the STEM OPT, the 3-year work permit, and do they push back against policies, regulations that are challenges for international students?
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the great things that's happened in the last few years is we've been working with the Chamber of Commerce, for example, who's very interested in the international student programs in general, but especially the optional practical training programs, because it's a great way for employers. I can tell you from having worked in a law office doing immigration law, it is very expensive to hire a foreign national. This idea that somebody just says, I'd rather hire a foreign national than an American worker. So I'm going to go pay, a lawyer $10,000 and I'm going to go pay these $5,000 in fees. I never saw that happen. It was pure desperation for the kind of talent that they needed. And so you don't have to do that for the optional practical training program. The student's advisor at the school, once the student graduates, the student's advisor authorizes him for practical training, and then they have to file an application with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's not too expensive, and it usually doesn't take too long to get adjudicated. And then the student has a work card. So it's the easiest way to bring a student into your company and see if this is going to be a person you'd like to hire further. And so, yes, businesses have been just at their wits' end about U.S. business immigration policy. Some of them have been moving operations to Canada and just sending people there just to avoid our crazy, bizarre, broken immigration system. And I think anybody who works in the system, whether you think it's whether you're a hard anti-immigration person or a pro-immigration person, we all agree that it is badly, deeply flawed and broken. So huge problem. So yeah, businesses have been great allies, business organizations, and they're at their wits' end.
Right. So speaking of anyone who works in this business, we actually have a question and a thank you. So this person said, thank you for taking time out of your day to present on this interesting subject. And they're asking you, could you please explain your job title and what your workday typically involves? Also, can you touch on your background and how you reached your position?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I have a weird, sort of a weird background. I went to law school, and then after that, I went into Peace Corps, as you mentioned in my bio, and I went to Poland. And then I came back for more grad school. I was working on a PhD at Emory University in Atlanta. And I got connected up with some international students there, and they introduced me to the International Programs Office, and I ended up working in that office for a while. And long story short, I fell into this world of international education. And I spent about half the time of my adult life working at universities in that area, like you have at your institution, the International Programs Office. I did the student work for a while, and then what we call scholars, which is the faculty and researchers visas. And then I worked as an immigration lawyer also, which I loved as well. And then at some point, yeah, 10 years ago, a friend of mine at NAFSA said, you know, you ought to come to work here. And I thought, gosh, I don't know if I want to work in Washington, D.C., but I came here. I loved it. It's been really fun. As I mentioned earlier, there have been, you know, these have been a few difficult years for my job. Just to give you a really short explanation of what I think has happened. You know, I still work with a lot of the nice people, well-meaning people who work at these federal agencies that I used to work with in the prior administration. But they feel a different kind of pressure. And I mean, you can just, you know this from just how many people have been fired by the administration. And so the folks that we work with have been very scared to do the kind of stakeholder engagement that they used to. But we still do some, and we still have good relationships with them. It was super active during the prior administration. We were constantly doing, letting them know what we needed, letting them know what was working that they were doing, letting them know what was not working. You know, they don't always obviously do what we want them to, even no matter who the administration is. But it's nice when they listen to us about what will work better for international programs that will still keep security and so forth enhanced. We all share that as a goal. And so, yeah, so I had to have this weird job title, but it basically means that I try to let the government know what my 10,000 members are experiencing that's not working well, what is working well, and what else they could do to help. And often that ends up being, you know, suggesting new policies, suggesting new regulations. Have a big conference every year, which I hope some of you will have a chance to come to someday, which is also 10,000 people coming together and discussing all this. So it's a pretty interesting time.
So you're clearly a spokesperson for a lot of us who work in university systems. You mentioned the question of security, and we actually have a question related to that as well. And someone asked, what can we do to instill a sense of security for future international students as they see how drastically different administrations can be when it comes to immigration policies that directly affect them?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I'm kind of really worried about. Just like you know, so many aspects of a changing government that's changing so dramatically from one administration to the next. It's just sort of like you get whiplash. I will say this. I think a lot of students are not going to notice that many, assuming that some of the things in the works right now, the clock runs out on them and they're not made final regulations and so forth. Most of the bad stuff that happened will have been the rhetoric of the last 4 years. So I hope and I assume that will get fixed pretty quickly. Again, if we have something like the Homeland Security Academic Advisory Council, again, where we have the Secretary of Homeland Security saying, we're all about security. However, we love having international students here. We think it makes us more secure. That kind of thing, I think, could help a lot. So I hope we'll just do a lot of the government will do at our request, and I know the request of a lot of others, just a lot of good public relations to feel that they're welcome here. And, you know, we have the Connecting Our World link that I mentioned. We have a whole program called You Are Welcome Here. And it's just a way of trying to make sure that students and prospective students don't only hear the stuff on the news that makes them think they aren't welcome, but they hear from a lot of the rest of us who make them know that they really are welcome and valued here.
And it's a very good point you mentioned, that the rhetoric of how we are treating anyone who's coming to study for short in the US is definitely very important. But the parallel of that, or the flip side of it, is American students who are also going abroad. And our last question is actually pertaining to that. Cynthia asked, will this whole process of how we are presenting immigration regulations for people coming in, will this have an impact on American students wishing to study or work abroad?
That is a great question. I wonder about that. That is, I have colleagues at NAFSA. So I work on what we call the inbound stuff, right? That's like the students and the faculty and researchers and employees coming into the country is what falls into my scope of duties. But my colleagues work on the education abroad aspect. And, they have seen tremendous growth in ed abroad programs in recent years. It's just exploded. And so I hope, yeah, it would be surprising to me if just a few years of, politicians yammering makes people stop that. I don't know, though. I really, I hope not. That would be really sad if American students feel disincentivized to go study. I suspect that Americans aren't as well thought of as they were, maybe 20 years ago in some places. And so I know that can be difficult, but I work with people who are in international offices doing ed abroad, and they're doing great work, and they're still sending students to fantastic programs in other countries. So I hope that does not change. I think we can all work to try to make sure it doesn't. That's so important for people to go have that international experience.
Mhm. And we would completely trust you because you have definitely benefited, as you said earlier. Uh,
Changed my life, that's for sure.
That's just a little thing. It just changed your life. That's all. Well, Steve, we want to thank you for coming and joining us today. Just because for a person who doesn't work in international education, these things can be very mind-blowing and mind-blowingly confusing for us. And I appreciate, and so does our audience, that you really broke down these different concepts and made it very easy for us to understand. I do have a message for our audience as well. I know that some of you have very specific questions about your own immigration status. I would recommend that if you are an international student, please contact the Center for Global Engagement. If you are interested or have further questions for Mr. Springer, please contact me. I'll be happy to direct you to resources that work. And I would really appreciate if everyone could just come and show applause for our speaker for today. I would really be appreciative of all of you. Thank you for joining us. And please keep attending Engage Your World events. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Employment workshops. That's a message from our associate director.
Yeah, well, you have an amazing international office at FSU. So yeah, go get your good advice from those great people.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. There's one. Yeah.
Have a good evening. Bye.
Thanks.
And
Bye.
again, Kristen Hagen, our associate director, saying, please come to the spring employment workshop where there'll be an immigration attorney present and they can answer your questions. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.